The chilly autumn air rushed in as the heavy wooden door to classroom 103 swung open. Mei Chen slipped inside, clutching her worn notebook to her chest, eyes fixed on the floor. She was 20 minutes early, just as she'd planned. Being first meant she could choose a seat in the back row, away from curious glances and the professor's attention. The piano fundamentals classroom at Wellington Music Academy smelled of polished wood and sheet music. Morning light streamed through tall windows, highlighting dust particles dancing in the air. Mei set her backpack down and pulled out a slightly tattered music theory book, a library copy she'd checked out 3 times already. For weeks since her mid-semester transfer, this had been her routine. Arrive early, sit in the back, speak only when spoken to, take detailed notes, leave quietly when class ended. Her small-town scholarship to this prestigious academy still felt like a dream, or sometimes, on harder days, a mistake. The other students moved through the hallways with the easy confidence of people who belonged, many of them from families where music lessons started before they could even reach the piano pedals. They carried expensive instruments and designer bags, chatting about summer music camps in Europe and private tutors. Mei turned to a fresh page in her notebook and wrote the date in neat, precise handwriting. Just 3 more months until the end of the semester. 3 months of keeping her head down, working twice as hard as everyone else, and hopefully proving that her scholarship wasn't wasted on her. The door opened again as other students began trickling in. 2 girls entered laughing about something on a phone screen, followed by a tall boy with tousled hair carrying a coffee cup. None of them noticed Mei, which was exactly how she preferred it. "Did you hear about Professor Harrington's piano fundamentals exam last semester?" One girl whispered loudly to her friend. Half the class failed. He made this one guy play the same measure 20 times until he got it perfect. Mei's stomach tightened. She'd heard the rumors about Professor Harrington since her first day. Brilliant but merciless. A former concert pianist whose promising career ended with a hand injury, now famous for holding students to impossible standards. By 8:55, the classroom was nearly full. The grand piano at the front gleamed under the lights, its lid propped open. Surrounding it were 20 chairs arranged in a semicircle, all filled except for the one directly in the pianist's line of sight, the spot everyone avoided. The door swung open one final time, and conversation immediately died. Professor Harrington entered with a stack of sheet music tucked under one arm. He was younger than Mei had expected when she first saw him, maybe early 40s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His posture was impeccable, shoulders squared as if he were about to walk onto a concert stage. "Good morning," he said, voice crisp and accented with what Mei guessed was a British boarding school education. Without waiting for a response, he placed his materials on the small desk beside the piano. "Today we'll be discussing interpretation of Romantic-era compositions. But first," he scanned the room, eyes narrowing slightly, "I'd like to see what you've retained from our previous lessons." The tension in the room thickened. Professor Harrington was known for these impromptu evaluations, calling on students without warning to demonstrate techniques or play passages from memory. "Let's see. Mr. Reynolds, please explain the difference between rubato and ritardando," he said, pointing to the boy with the coffee cup. The boy straightened in his chair. Rubato is taking time from one note and giving it to another while keeping the overall tempo, like borrowing time. Ritardando is a gradual slowing down of the entire tempo. Professor Harrington nodded curtly. "Acceptable. Ms. Patel, demonstrate a B-flat minor scale. 2 octaves." A girl with a long braid walked to the piano and played the scale perfectly. If mechanically, good technique, though rather soulless, Professor Harrington commented as she returned to her seat, cheeks flushed. This continued for several minutes. With each student called, Mei sank lower in her chair, hoping to become invisible. She'd practiced all the scales religiously in the practice rooms late at night when no one was around to hear her mistakes. She knew the theory. But performing in front of this room of strangers under the critical gaze of Professor Harrington? The thought made her palms sweat. "Now," the professor said after interrogating 6 students, "I'd like to discuss interpretation." He walked to the whiteboard and wrote, "Technical proficiency vs. artistic expression" in bold letters. "Many of you can play the notes correctly. Few of you can make anyone care." He turned back to the class, scanning the faces before him. The Romantic period was defined by emotion, by the composer's desire to move the audience. Technical skill without expression is just— He paused, searching for the right word. Typing. A few students chuckled nervously. Take Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of his most famous works composed when he was just 19 years old. He walked to the piano and played the opening chords, the familiar dramatic sequence filling the room. Many pianists can play the notes. Few can capture the melancholy, the tension, the emotional journey. He played a few more measures, his injured hand clearly still capable of impressive dexterity, before stopping abruptly. The piece requires both technical mastery and emotional intelligence. Without both, you're just making noise. Professor Harrington's eyes swept the classroom again, and May felt a chill as his gaze passed over her. Don't look at me, she silently pleaded. Please don't look at me. I notice we have a scholarship student who transferred mid-semester, he said, eyes locking onto her. Ms. Chen, is it? 21 heads turned to stare at May. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Yes, sir, she managed to say, her voice barely audible. From Little River Conservatory? I'm not familiar with it. His tone suggested he doubted it was worth knowing. It's a small community music school in Georgia, May explained, feeling heat rise to her face. I see. The two words contained volumes of judgment. Well, Ms. Chen, since you've been remarkably quiet these past few weeks, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding of the concept. Please come to the piano. This wasn't a request. May's legs felt wooden as she stood. The distance to the piano seemed to stretch endlessly. She could feel everyone watching her, making assumptions based on her second-hand clothes and the way she clutched her pencil too tightly. I'd like you to play the opening of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, Professor Harrington said when she reached the bench. I assume you're familiar with it? May nodded slightly. Familiar was an understatement. She'd listened to recordings of Vladimir Ashkenazy playing it hundreds of times on the ancient CD player in her grandmother's house. She'd watched YouTube videos of performances on the library computer, studying finger positions and pedal techniques. And in the darkness of empty recital halls long after everyone had gone home, she'd taught herself to play it note by note. But no one here knew that. No one knew that music was the language that made sense to her when words failed. That the piano in her grandmother's living room was where she'd spent every free moment since she was 3 years old. That she'd applied to this academy on a desperate wish, never expecting to actually get in. The sheet music, Professor Harrington said, placing it on the stand, though a pianist at this level should be able to play at least the opening from memory. Several students exchanged glances. The message was clear. This new girl was about to be humiliated. Professor Harrington often used these demonstrations to underscore the gap between proper training and inadequate preparation. May sat at the bench, adjusting its height. The keys before her were pristine, unmarked by the years of use that had yellowed the keys of her grandmother's upright piano. This Steinway was worth more than her entire family's possessions combined. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness. For a moment, doubt crashed over her. What was she doing here, pretending she belonged among these properly trained musicians? She'd never had a real piano teacher. Everything she knew came from listening, watching, and endless hours of solitary practice. We're waiting, Miss Chen, Professor Harrington said, impatience edging his voice. Someone snickered in the back. Another student whispered something May couldn't hear. She closed her eyes briefly, pushing away the classroom, the stares, the judgment. In her mind, she was back in her grandmother's living room, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the smell of jasmine tea in the air. Play from your heart, her grandmother always said. The fingers will follow. May took a deep breath and began to play. The opening bell-like tolls emerged from the piano, each note clear and resonant. The famous sequence of chords followed, her fingers finding their positions with the certainty of long familiarity. As she continued into the piece, something shifted inside her. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it transformed, channeling into the music instead of blocking it. She forgot about Professor Harrington watching her with critical eyes. Forgot about the other students and their assumptions. There was only the music speaking through her hands, telling its story of darkness and light, tension and release. When she finished the opening section and the final notes hung in the air, May opened her eyes, suddenly remembering where she was. The classroom was completely silent. 21 faces stared at her with expressions ranging from surprise to disbelief. Professor Harrington's face had transformed completely. The stern judgment was gone, replaced by something May couldn't quite identify. Shock, certainly, but also something that looked almost like respect. "Ms. Chen," he said finally, breaking the silence, "I believe we've been underestimating you." The silence in classroom 103 stretched for what felt like an eternity. May's hands remained hovering over the keys, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The last notes of Rachmaninoff's prelude still seemed to hang in the air. Professor Harrington cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Well," he said, his voice notably softer than before. "That was unexpected." May's cheeks burned. She stared down at the piano keys, unsure what to do next. Should she return to her seat? Say something? The spotlight she'd spent weeks avoiding now felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Professor Harrington asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier condescension. Before May could answer, a student in the front row, a boy with glasses and a serious expression, began to clap. The sound startled May. Then another student joined in and another until the entire classroom erupted in spontaneous applause. May glanced up, bewildered by the reaction. These were the same students who had barely acknowledged her existence for weeks. Now they were looking at her with expressions ranging from admiration to shock to, in a few cases, something that looked uncomfortably like envy. "Thank you," she mumbled, sliding off the piano bench.
"May I go back to my seat now?"
Professor Harrington shook his head. "Not yet, Miss Chen. I'd like you to continue the piece." May hesitated. "The whole thing?" "Yes, the whole thing. Unless you'd prefer not to?" It wasn't really a question. May sat back down, took a deep breath, and began again from the beginning. This time, knowing what was expected, she let herself sink deeper into the music. Her fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, navigating the complex middle section where rolling arpeggios gave way to thundering chords. The piece was a journey through emotional landscapes, from the somber opening to the tempestuous middle, finally resolving in a funeral march of chords. May had always imagined it as the musical equivalent of moving through grief, denial, anger, and finally, acceptance. As she played the final, resolving chord, she realized her eyes were damp. When she finished, the applause was immediate and louder than before. Someone in the back whispered, "Wow," loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Ms. Chen," Professor Harrington said when the applause died down, "would you mind staying after class? I'd like to speak with you." May nodded, a knot forming in her stomach as she returned to her seat. For the remainder of the class, she could barely focus on Professor Harrington's lecture about Romantic-era composers. Every few minutes, she'd catch someone staring at her, quickly looking away when she noticed the girl sitting beside her, Lily, if May remembered correctly, leaned over and whispered, "That was seriously amazing. How come you never said anything about being able to play like that?" May shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Nobody asked," she whispered back. When class ended, students filed out slowly, several of them pausing to say something complimentary to May. "Nice playing," said one. "You crushed it," said another. The boy with glasses stopped beside her desk and said, quite formally, "Your interpretation was superb. The dynamics in the middle section particularly." May thanked them awkwardly, unused to being the center of attention. She remained seated until the room emptied, then approached Professor Harrington's desk where he was organizing sheet music. "You wanted to speak with me, sir?" she asked quietly. He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down." When she did, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your abilities based on incomplete information." May fidgeted with the strap of her backpack. "It's okay, no it's not. Good teachers don't do that." He put his glasses back on and looked at her directly. "Now I'd like to understand. You've been in my class for 3 weeks. During that time, you've never volunteered to demonstrate at the piano. Your written work is competent but unremarkable. Yet you just played one of Rachmaninoff's more challenging preludes with the interpretation of someone far beyond basic piano fundamentals. Why the disconnect?" May looked down at her hands. The question hung in the air between them. "I didn't want to stand out," she finally said. "Stand out?" Professor Harrington repeated, sounding genuinely puzzled. "Miss Chen, you're at a music academy. The entire point is to develop your talents, not hide them. I know, but May struggled to find the right words. How could she explain the complicated feelings she had about her playing? The fear of expectations, of not measuring up, of being seen as different. It's easier sometimes to just blend in. Professor Harrington leaned back in his chair, studying her. Where did you learn to play like that? Your file says you transferred from Little River Conservatory, but frankly, I've never heard of it. It's not a real conservatory, May admitted. It's just what the locals call it. It's a community music center in a converted church. They give lessons to kids who can't afford private teachers. And who taught you there? Mrs. Abernathy, for theory classes. But for piano, May hesitated. Mostly I taught myself. Professor Harrington's eyebrows shot up. Self-taught? He seemed at a loss for words. Remarkable if true. But surely someone guided your technique. Me thought of her grandmother's small living room, the upright piano with the chipped ivory keys and slightly out-of-tune middle register. The hours spent playing along with CDs, rewinding sections over and over until she could match them, note for note. My grandmother showed me the basics when I was little. In China, before we moved here. After that, I just practiced a lot. And I watched videos and listened to recordings. Videos and recordings, Professor Harrington repeated slowly, as if trying to process this information. Ms. Chen, do you know how many students come through these doors who've had formal training since they were 5 years old and still can't play with half the musicality you just demonstrated? May didn't know how to respond to that. What other pieces can you play? He asked. Some Bach preludes and fugues, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, parts of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, but I'm still working on the third movement. She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about listing her repertoire. Professor Harrington was watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. And you learned all these by ear? By watching videos? And reading music, May added quickly. I can read music, Mrs. Abernathy made sure of that. I should hope so, he said dryly. Ms. Chen, may I ask why you came to Wellington? With your abilities, you could have applied to Juilliard, Curtis, or Eastman. May almost laughed at the suggestion. Those schools cost a fortune, and they'd want to see my training history. Recommendations from well-known teachers. She shook her head. Wellington was offering a diversity scholarship for students from underrepresented backgrounds in classical music. It was a long shot, but I sent in a recording. I never really thought I'd get in. What recording did you submit? Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Professor Harrington nodded thoughtfully. A good choice to demonstrate clean technique, but not particularly challenging. Certainly nothing that would have indicated. He gestured vaguely toward the piano. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman with silver-streaked hair poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, Daniel, but your masterclass starts in 5 minutes. Thank you, Vivian. I'll be right there. After she left, he turned back to May. I need to go, but this conversation isn't over. I'd like you to come to my office hours tomorrow. 3 o'clock. Am I in trouble? May asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. Professor Harrington looked surprised. Trouble? No, quite the opposite. We need to discuss your placement. Clearly, Piano Fundamentals isn't the right class for you. He stood and gathered his materials. And Ms. Chen? I'd like you to prepare something for tomorrow. Your choice. Something that showcases what you can really do. After he left, May remained sitting, trying to process what had just happened. The classroom was quiet now. Afternoon sunlight slanting through the windows and illuminating dust motes in the air. She walked slowly to the piano and sat down at the bench again, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. For years, she'd practiced in secret, in empty classrooms after hours, in church basements when no one was around, at home with a digital keyboard and headphones late at night. Music had been her private joy, her escape. Now suddenly it was out in the open. People had heard her play. They knew. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. May placed her hands on the keys and began to play softly. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but Debussy's Clair de Lune, its gentle, impressionistic notes filling the empty classroom. She played it from memory, letting the dreamy, moonlit quality of the piece wash over her. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice someone had entered the room until she finished the piece and heard a quiet, "That was beautiful." Startled, May turned to see the boy with glasses, the first one who had applauded earlier, standing near the door. "Sorry," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. I didn't mean to interrupt. I forgot my theory notebook. He gestured to a desk in the front row. It's okay, May said, standing up from the bench. I should go anyway. The boy retrieved his notebook, then hesitated. I'm Jin, by the way. Jin Park, Mei-chin. I know. He smiled slightly. Everyone knows after today. May felt her cheeks warm. Great. That's not a bad thing, Jin said quickly. What you did was pretty incredible. Professor Harrington doesn't impress easily. Thanks, May said, unsure what else to say. Jin seemed about to leave, then turned back. A bunch of us practice together sometimes in the evening. Peer feedback, you know? You should join us, if you want. The old May would have politely declined, made an excuse about needing to study. But something had changed today. A door had opened, and she wasn't sure she could close it again even if she wanted to. Maybe I will, she said. Thanks. As she packed up her things and left the classroom, May felt as if she were walking on unfamiliar ground. For better or worse, she could no longer hide in the shadows. Her secret was out. She could play, really play. And now everyone knew it, including the intimidating Professor Harrington. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, she would have to play again, this time with full awareness of what she was revealing. The thought sent a mix of fear and excitement coursing through her. For the first time since arriving at Wellington, May found herself looking forward to tomorrow. May spent that night in a practice room until the security guard kindly but firmly told her the building was closing. She'd cycled through piece after piece, trying to decide what to play for Professor Harrington the next day. Bach was safe, structured, mathematical, precise. Chopin showed emotional range but might be considered too conventional. Liszt would demonstrate technical skill, but was she ready to be that showy? Back in her small dormitory room, May sat cross-legged on her bed, headphones plugged into her digital keyboard as she continued practicing well past midnight. Her roommate, a voice major named Zoe, who was rarely around, had left a sticky note on the door. Heard what happened in Harrington's class. Rockstar, let's get coffee sometime! May smiled faintly at the note. 3 weeks of barely acknowledging each other's existence, and now Zoe wanted coffee. Morning came too quickly. May dragged herself through music history and theory classes, where several students who had never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to sit nearby. Word had spread, as it always did in the small, insular world of the academy. By lunchtime, May had received smiles and nods from students she'd never even seen before. You're famous, Jin commented when he spotted her in the dining hall, clutching her tray and looking for an empty table. Mind if I join you? Grateful for a familiar face, May nodded. They found a table in the corner, away from the busy center of the cafeteria. Did you decide what you're playing for Harrington? Jin asked, unwrapping his sandwich. How did you know about that? Jin shrugged. People talk, especially about anything involving Harrington. He doesn't usually take special interest in first years. I'm still deciding, May admitted. Maybe Liszt's La Campanella. Jin's eyebrows shot up. Seriously? That's one of the most technically challenging pieces in the repertoire. Is it too ambitious? Not if you can play it. Jin studied her curiously. Can you? May poked at her salad. Most of it. The middle section with the jumps still gives me trouble sometimes. Unbelievable, Jin muttered, shaking his head. You know, most of us had to audition with pieces we'd been working on for months, right? And here you are casually considering La Campanella for a drop-by meeting. I've been working on it too, May said defensively, for almost a year now. Without a teacher? YouTube has some really good tutorials. Jin stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. Sorry, he said when he saw her expression. It's just, that's like saying you learned brain surgery from watching Grey's Anatomy. Despite herself, May smiled. It's not quite the same thing. It kind of is, though. Jin took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. Most of us have had private lessons since we were kids. Competitions, summer programs, master classes, the whole classical music conveyor belt. And then there's you, learning Rachmaninoff and Liszt from YouTube. He shook his head again. No wonder Harrington looked like he'd seen a ghost. May picked at her food. It wasn't just YouTube. I had recordings too, and I practiced a lot. How much is a lot? She thought about it. Before coming here? 4 to 5 hours on school days. More on weekends. 8 or 9 hours sometimes, Jin whistled softly. That's conservatory-level dedication. I didn't have much else to do, May said simply. My grandmother works long hours at the family restaurant. We don't have money for movies or trips or anything like that. Playing was free, except for the piano. We already had one. It was my grandmother's from China. Very old, not great quality, but it worked. Their conversation was interrupted by a tall, elegant girl who stopped by their table. Me recognized her from Piano Fundamentals, one of the students who always volunteered to demonstrate, whose technique was flawless if somewhat lacking in expression. Jin. The girl flicked her gaze to May. You must be the prodigy everyone's talking about. I'm not a prodigy, May said quickly. I'm May. Vanessa, the girl said without offering her hand. I just wanted to say your Rachmaninoff was interesting. Bold choice to take so many liberties with the tempo in the middle section. Thanks, May said, uncertain whether this was a compliment or criticism. Anyway, Vanessa continued, turning back to Jin. Practice group tonight at 7 in room 415. You're bringing the snacks. With a final glance at May, she added, you can come too if you want. If you're not too busy with your private session with Harrington. After she left, Jin rolled his eyes. Don't mind Vanessa. She's actually nice once you get past the competitive thing. Are all piano majors like that? Like what? Intense? Slightly neurotic perfectionist with something to prove? Jin grinned. Pretty much, yeah. Comes with the territory. May checked her watch. I should go. My meeting with Professor Harrington is in an hour, and I want to practice a little first. Good luck. Not that you need it, Jin added. And seriously, come tonight if you want. 7 o'clock, room 415. The practice group is actually helpful once you get past all the egos. Maybe, May said, though she was already thinking she probably wouldn't go. One performance had already brought more attention than she was comfortable with. She wasn't sure she was ready for more. At exactly 3 o'clock, May knocked on Professor Harrington's office door, her heart pounding uncomfortably. Enter, called his crisp voice from within. The office was smaller than she'd expected, lined with bookshelves stuffed with music scores and books. A baby grand piano took up nearly half the space. Professor Harrington sat behind a cluttered desk, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he reviewed some papers. Ms. Chen, he said, looking up. Right on time. May stood awkwardly just inside the doorway, unsure whether to sit or remain standing. Please sit, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I've been reviewing your application materials. He held up a folder. Your entrance recording was competent, but hardly hinted at what you demonstrated yesterday. Why is that? Mee shifted in her seat. The scholarship had specific requirements. Bach's Prelude in C major was on the list of acceptable pieces. Yes, but you could have submitted an additional piece of your choice. Most applicants did. May looked down at her hands. I didn't want to seem presumptuous. Professor Harrington removed his glasses, setting them on the desk. Ms. Chen, I've been teaching for 15 years. In that time, I've encountered perhaps 3 students with natural ability, comparable to what you demonstrated yesterday. All of them had been training at elite institutions since childhood. He leaned forward slightly. What you've accomplished through self-teaching is unusual. Frankly, it shouldn't be possible. I'm sorry? No, don't apologize. It's remarkable, but it also presents a challenge for us as an institution. May's stomach tightened. What kind of challenge? Wellington has a structured curriculum. Students progress through levels based on their entrance auditions and subsequent evaluations. You were placed in fundamentals because your application suggested that was appropriate. He tapped her folder. Clearly it's not. The question is, where do we place you now? I still have a lot to learn, May said quickly. My technique isn't formally trained. I'm sure there are gaps, without question, Professor Harrington interrupted. Self-teaching inevitably leads to bad habits and gaps in fundamentals. However, your musicality, he paused, seeming to search for the right words. That can't be taught, not really. We can refine it, channel it, but the core gift, you either have it or you don't. He stood and walked to the piano. Now you were going to play something for me. Your choice, I believe I said. May nodded, rising from her chair. As she approached the piano, she made her decision. Not Bach, not Chopin, not even Liszt. Instead, she sat down and began to play Debussy's Reflets dans l'eau from Images, Book 1. The piece was all water and light, impressionistic and evocative. It required a delicate touch, a sensitive use of the pedal, and an understanding of color and texture and sound. As she played, May thought of the small pond behind her grandmother's house in China, how the early morning sun would catch the ripples and transform them into shimmering gold. When she finished, the office was silent except for the fading resonance of the final chord. Professor Harrington had been standing with his arms crossed, listening intently. Now he nodded slowly. Interesting choice. Not what I expected. You've heard a lot of Liszt and Chopin from students trying to show off their technique, May said quietly. I thought this might be different. Indeed. Your pedaling could use refinement, but your understanding of the piece's architecture was evident. How did you approach learning it? May thought about the question. I listened to different recordings. Uchida, Polini, Zimmermann. Each brought something different to it. Then I tried to find my own way through my own story in the music. And what story did you find? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. It reminds me of a place I knew as a child. A pond where I would sit with my grandmother in the early morning, the way light moved on water, how everything was constantly changing yet somehow staying the same. Professor Harrington nodded, something softening in his expression. Music is indeed storytelling without words. Many students with perfect technique never grasp that essential truth. He returned to his desk and sat down. Ms. Chen, I'd like to make a proposal. May waited, tense with anticipation. You clearly don't belong in piano fundamentals. Based on what I've heard, you could potentially test into our advanced performance track. However, he held up a hand as if anticipating her response. I believe that would be a mistake. Why? Me asked, trying not to sound disappointed. Because despite your remarkable natural ability, you have technical gaps that would eventually become problematic in that setting. What I propose instead is a dual approach. He folded his hands on the desk. You'll continue in some foundational courses to address those gaps, but I'd also like you to join my advanced interpretation seminar, which is normally reserved for third and fourth year students. May blinked in surprise. But won't they resent having a first year in their class? Perhaps initially, Professor Harrington acknowledged, but I believe you have something valuable to contribute and much to learn from them as well. Different perspectives, different approaches. He paused. I'd also like to suggest private lessons to address your specific technical needs. I have a colleague, Professor Lin, who specializes in technical refinement, and if you're amenable, I'd be interested in working with you myself on interpretive development. May stared at him, overwhelmed. That's very generous. But the scholarship only covers basic tuition. I can't afford private lessons. There are additional scholarship funds available for exceptional circumstances. Professor Harrington picked up a pen and made a note in her file. I believe this qualifies. Leave the financial aspects to me. As May left Professor Harrington's office 20 minutes later, her mind was spinning with everything they'd discussed. Schedule changes, new classes, private lessons, scholarship adjustments. It was a complete reorganization of her academic life. And all because she'd played a piece of music she knew by heart. She wandered through the campus in a daze, eventually finding herself in front of the practice room building as the afternoon light began to fade. Through the windows, she could see students bent over instruments, faces intense with concentration. She had always been one of them, anonymous, dedicated, private in her pursuit. Now something had changed. Her carefully maintained invisibility was gone. People knew her name, had expectations, would be watching. The thought was terrifying. It was also, May realized with surprise, just a little bit exciting. 2 weeks after her meeting with Professor Harrington, May found herself in a practice room late at night, struggling through a series of technical exercises that Professor Lin had assigned. Her fingers stumbled over the same passage for the 5th time, and she let out a frustrated sigh. Problems? May jumped at the voice. Jin stood in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. Sorry, he said. Door was open. I heard you playing the same thing over and over. May rubbed her tired hands. Professor Lin's exercises, they're supposed to correct my improper wrist alignment and insufficient finger independence. She mimicked the professor's precise way of speaking. Jin smiled. The famous Lin technique drills. Everyone hates them, but they work. He stepped into the room. Mind if I show you something? May scooted over on the bench. Jin sat beside her and demonstrated a modified version of the exercise she'd been struggling with. Start slower than you think necessary, he explained, and focus on the sensation in your hand, not just hitting the right notes. He played the passage with careful precision, his wrist at a slight angle that looked more natural than what Professor Lin had demonstrated. Like this, see? May tried it his way and the passage flowed more easily. Better, Jin said. Lin's brilliant, but sometimes her approach is too mechanical. Been studying with her for 3 years, and I've learned you have to adapt her techniques to your own hands. Thanks, May said. Genuinely grateful. I've been at this for hours, I figured. It's almost midnight, you know. Building closes soon. May glanced at the clock in surprise. I lost track of time. You usually do. I've noticed you're always the last one out of here. Jin stood up. A bunch of us are grabbing late-night waffles at Denny's. Want to come? Her first instinct was to decline, as she had with every social invitation over the past 2 weeks. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the genuine friendliness in Jin's expression, or maybe she was just tired of practicing scales in an empty building. Sure, she said finally. Waffles sound good. 20 minutes later, May found herself squeezed into a booth at Denny's with Jin and 4 other students from the piano department. There was Vanessa, who seemed less intimidating outside of school. Thomas, a second year with wild curly hair. Diane, a quiet girl who specialized in contemporary compositions. And Alex, who apparently never went anywhere without his well-worn book of Beethoven sonatas. So then Baumgartner says, "That's not staccato, that's just you having a seizure at the keyboard," Thomas was saying, finishing a story that had everyone laughing. His metaphors get more outrageous every year, Vanessa said, stirring her coffee. Last week he told me my Bach sounded like a mathematical equation with feelings. That's actually kind of a compliment for Bach, Alex pointed out. May listened, fascinated by the easy banter, the shared language of inside jokes and musical references. These were people who understood the specific frustrations and joys of dedicating your life to an instrument. Who didn't think it was strange to spend 8 hours practicing a single piece or to have dreams about fingering patterns? May, Diane said, turning to her, how's the advanced interpretation seminar going? Is it as terrifying as everyone says? All eyes turned to May, who took a sip of water to buy time. The seminar had indeed been intimidating. 9 third and fourth year students plus her, all expected to perform and critique each other's work under Professor Harrington's exacting standards. It's challenging, she admitted. Last session we spent 2 hours analyzing just the first movement of Beethoven's Appassionata. That's actually restrained for Harrington, Alex said. Last year he spent 3 weeks on a single Chopin nocturne. But he must think you're something special, Vanessa said, a hint of her old competitiveness creeping into her voice. First years never get into that seminar. I'm just trying not to embarrass myself, May said honestly. Oh, please. Thomas waved dismissively. We all heard about your Rachmaninoff, and Lynn doesn't take just anyone for private lessons. She rejected 3 scholarship students last year. Speaking of performances, Jin said, smoothly changing the subject, has everyone submitted their preferences for the winter showcase? Deadline's tomorrow. The conversation shifted to the upcoming showcase, a major event where selected students performed for faculty, family, and local arts patrons. May listened with interest but no intention of participating. She was still adjusting to her new schedule, still trying to fill the gaps in her technique that her teachers kept identifying. You should sign up too, May, Diane suggested. It's a good experience. I'm not ready for that, May said quickly. Wasn't Harrington just saying in seminar last week that you should start thinking about performance opportunities? Jin asked innocently. May shot him a betrayed look. He might have mentioned it. Then it's settled, Vanessa declared. I know someone on the student committee. I can make sure you get a spot, but... No buts, Tomas interrupted. We all have to suffer through it. It's a Wellington rite of passage. By the time they left Denny's at nearly 2 in the morning, May had somehow been talked into not only signing up for the showcase but also joining their weekly practice group. As she walked back to her dorm with Jin, she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or alarmed by how quickly these people had pulled her into their orbit. They're good folks, Jin said, as if reading her thoughts. Intense about music, but who isn't at Wellington? Vanessa still seems a little competitive. Yeah, that's just her way. She actually recommended you for the showcase, you know. Said your Debussy interpretation was, and I quote, infuriatingly natural. May laughed despite herself. Is that a compliment? From Vanessa? Definitely. The next few weeks passed in a blur of classes, practice sessions, and new friendships. May found herself slowly emerging from the protective shell she'd built around herself. She still preferred practicing alone, still sometimes felt overwhelmed by the attention her playing received, but she no longer flinched when someone complimented her or invited her to join a study group. Then came the Wednesday when everything threatened to fall apart. May arrived at her private lesson with Professor Lin to find both Lin and Professor Harrington waiting for her, their expressions serious. "Ms. Chen," Professor Harrington said, "please sit down." May's mind raced through possible scenarios. Was she being dropped from the advanced seminar? Had her scholarship been revoked? Had someone discovered she didn't belong here after all? "We've been reviewing your progress," Professor Lin said, her posture as precise as her speech. "While your technical improvement is commendable, we're concerned about your reluctance to participate in performance opportunities." "I signed up for the winter showcase," May said defensively, "after considerable peer pressure, from what I understand," Professor Harrington noted with a slight smile. "Ms. Chen, both Professor Lin and I believe you have exceptional potential, but potential without performance is ultimately meaningless in our profession." "What Professor Harrington is saying," Professor Lin continued, "is that you must begin taking more risks. You've been systematically avoiding situations where you might be judged or evaluated." May looked down at her hands. They weren't wrong. Despite joining the practice group in the showcase, she'd declined opportunities to play in master classes, had avoided the weekly student recitals, and had volunteered to page turn rather than perform at a recent departmental concert. "There's an opportunity we'd like you to consider," Professor Harrington said. "The Kaufman competition for young pianists is accepting applications for next spring." May's head snapped up. "The Kaufman? But that's for graduate students and professional pianists under 30. There's a youth division for outstanding undergraduates," Professor Lin explained. "Highly selective, of course." "I'm nowhere near that level," May protested. "My technique still needs years of work." "Your technique needs refinement, yes," Professor Harrington agreed. "But your musicality is already at a professional level. With focused preparation over the next 4 months, you could be a strong contender." "4 months isn't enough time," May said, panic rising in her throat. "It is if you commit fully," Professor Lin said firmly. "We would adjust your coursework to allow for intensive preparation. I would work with you 3 times weekly on technical aspects, and Professor Harrington would coach your interpretation." "We don't make this offer lightly," Professor Harrington added. "It would mean postponing some of your academic requirements until next year. But we believe the experience would be transformative for your development." "I need to think about it," May said weakly. "Of course," Professor Harrington said, "but don't think too long. Applications are due next Friday, and we would need to begin preparation immediately." That evening, May didn't go to the practice rooms as usual. Instead, she walked off campus to a small park and sat on a bench, watching children play on the swings as the autumn sun set behind the trees. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jin. "Practice room B4 is free if you're looking for one." She didn't reply. Her mind was too full of conflicting thoughts. The Kaufman competition was prestigious, career launching for winners, impressive even for finalists. But it was also very public, very visible. If she failed, everyone would know. If she succeeded, expectations would only grow higher. After an hour of sitting in the darkening park, May pulled out her phone and called the one person who might understand. "Nai," she said when her grandmother answered. "I need your advice." She explained the situation in a mix of English and Mandarin. The competition, her teacher's expectations, her own fears. "I don't know if I'm ready," May finished. "What if I embarrass myself? What if I'm not as good as they think I am?" There was a pause, and then her grandmother's voice came through, warm and steady as always. May, do you remember when you were small, maybe 6 years old, and you wanted to learn that Beethoven piece?" "For Elise," May said, smiling at the memory. "It was way too hard for me then." "Yes, too hard. I told you to wait, to learn simpler songs first. But every night after dinner I would hear you at the piano trying again and again. So stubborn." Her grandmother chuckled. "When you finally played it for me 3 weeks later, it wasn't perfect. But you did it because you weren't afraid to try. This is different, Nai. The Kaufman is a major competition. Yes, different scale, same choice. You can stay safe or you can grow." Her grandmother paused. The question isn't if you're ready. The question is, are you still that brave little girl who wasn't afraid to try something too difficult? After they hung up, May sat for a while longer in the park, watching the last children being called home as darkness fell. Then she pulled out her phone again and texted Jin, "Is practice room B4 still available?" "Grabbed it for you," came the immediate reply. "It's yours until midnight." "You okay?" "I will be," May wrote back. "Save me a seat at Denny's later?" "I have some news." As she walked back to campus, May felt something settle inside her. The fear was still there, but alongside it now was a quiet determination. She would apply for the Kaufman. She would work harder than she ever had before. And whatever happened, she would no longer hide her music or herself from the world. The practice room was waiting for her, its familiar upright piano like an old friend. May set her bag down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. Then she began to play, not exercises or competition pieces, but a simple melody her grandmother had taught her long ago, a Chinese folk song about a bird finding the courage to leave its nest and fly. It was time for May to fly too. 4 months passed like a whirlwind. May's life narrowed to a focused routine: morning technique work with Professor Lin, afternoon interpretation sessions with Professor Harrington. Evenings spent practicing until her fingers ached and her mind could barely process notes anymore. Weekends weren't weekends but longer practice days, interrupted only by necessary meals and too short sleep. "You need a break," Jin insisted one Saturday in late February, physically blocking the door to her practice room. "You've been at it for 6 hours straight." "The competition is in 3 weeks," May reminded him, trying to sidestep around his tall frame. "Exactly. And if you collapse from exhaustion before then, all this work will be for nothing." Jin crossed his arms. 1 hour. Fresh air. Real food that doesn't come from a vending machine. Then you can come back and practice until your fingers fall off. May relented, knowing he was right. Outside, the winter air was crisp but not bitterly cold, the sun providing a hint of warmth. They walked to a small cafe off campus where May realized she was actually starving once the smell of fresh bread hit her. "How's the list coming?" Jin asked as they waited for their sandwiches. "The technical parts are mostly there now. Professor Lin fixed my hand position for the jumps in the middle section." May demonstrated the motion in the air. "It's the interpretation that's still evolving. Professor Harrington keeps pushing me to find more layers in it." "That sounds like him. I've heard him say a piece of music is like an archaeological site. The deeper you dig, the more you discover." May smiled. "He said almost exactly that yesterday." Their food arrived, and May realized how much she'd missed simple pleasures like hot soup and conversation that wasn't about fingering or phrasing. Jin caught her up on academy gossip, who was dating whom, which professor had gone on another legendary rant, how Vanessa had nearly set fire to the microwave in the student lounge. "Everyone's coming to the competition, you know," Jin mentioned as they finished their meal. "Me, Vanessa, Thomas, Diane, Alex. We all requested the weekend off from work-study jobs." May felt a rush of gratitude mixed with anxiety. "You don't have to do that. It's a 3-hour drive to Philadelphia. Of course we're coming. You're one of us now. Besides," Jin grinned, "how often do we get to see a Wellington student compete at the Kaufman? Professor Harrington hasn't sponsored a student for it in 5 years. No pressure or anything," May said dryly. "You'll be amazing," Jin said with such certainty that May almost believed it herself. Later that night, after returning to her practice room until the building closed, May lay awake in her dormitory bed, too tired to sleep, her mind still running through passages of Liszt's Transcendental Etude No. 10 in F minor. She had chosen it for its complexity, its demand for both technical prowess and emotional range. Professor Harrington had approved her selection with a rare smile. "Ambitious," he'd said, "but if anyone can do it justice, it's you." Now, as the competition loomed just weeks away, May found herself oscillating between confidence and terror. Some days her playing flowed so naturally that she felt one with the music, as if her fingers were simply extensions of her thoughts. Other days she stumbled over passages she'd played perfectly 100 times, her mind freezing with what Professor Lin called performance anticipation. "It's normal," Lin had assured her. "Even the greatest pianists experience it. The key is to practice through it, to make your muscle memory so solid that it carries you through even when your conscious mind falters." Easier said than done, May thought as she finally drifted toward sleep, fingers still twitching with phantom notes. The weekend of the competition arrived with startling suddenness. One moment May was practicing obsessively. The next she was in Professor Harrington's car with Jin, who had insisted on coming along for moral support, driving to Philadelphia. The 3-hour journey passed with Professor Harrington, sharing stories of his own competition days. Jin asking thoughtful questions and May staring out the window, mentally rehearsing her piece. The hotel where the competition was being held was grander than anywhere May had ever stayed, all polished marble and crystal chandeliers. Their rooms were small but elegant, with crisp white linens and views of the city skyline. Registration is at 4, then the drawing for performance order, Professor Harrington reminded her as they checked in. Preliminaries begin tomorrow at 9. Get some rest tonight, Miss Chen. Tomorrow will be demanding. May nodded, clutching her room key. Thank you, Professor. For everything. A flicker of warmth passed across his usually composed face. You've earned this opportunity, Ms. Chen. Now make the most of it. That evening, after the drawing that placed her 11th out of 23 performers in the youth division, May tried to relax in her hotel room. She had brought her digital keyboard to practice silently, but after running through a few passages, she set it aside. Professor Lin's voice echoed in her head. The day before a performance is for mental preparation, not last-minute cramming. A knock at her door revealed Jin, holding 2 cups of hot tea from the lobby. Thought you might want this. Chamomile, supposed to be calming. Thanks, May said, accepting the cup gratefully. Are Vanessa and the others here yet? Just arrived. They're getting settled and want to take you to dinner, but I told them it's your call. If you need quiet time, they understand. May considered it. Part of her wanted to stay in her room, to focus and center herself. But another part recognized that sitting alone might only amplify her nerves. Dinner sounds good, actually, as long as it's somewhere quiet. The evening with her friends was exactly what May needed. A few hours when the competition wasn't the main topic of conversation, where laughter and stories created a bubble of normality around her. By the time she returned to her room, she felt more grounded than she had in weeks. Morning came all too quickly. May woke before her alarm, showered and dressed in the outfit she'd chosen carefully for the performance. A simple black dress with short sleeves, professional but allowing freedom of movement. She pinned her hair back neatly, applied minimal makeup, and met Professor Harrington for breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Eat something substantial, he advised, noting her hesitation over the menu. Performing requires physical energy. You don't want to be distracted by hunger. May obediently ordered eggs and toast, though her stomach felt too knotted to be hungry. As she forced herself to eat, Professor Harrington reviewed the day's schedule. The preliminary round will take most of the day. Judges will announce finalists this evening. If you advance, which I fully expect you will, the final round is tomorrow afternoon. How many advance? May asked. 6 from each division. The youth division has 23 entrants this year, so the odds are reasonable. He studied her over his coffee cup. How are you feeling? Nervous, May admitted. But ready, I think. Good. Nervousness is energy. Use it. Channel it into your performance. The competition hall was a mid-sized auditorium within the hotel complex, elegant without being intimidating. Backstage, competitors warmed up in small practice rooms or sat quietly reviewing scores. May found a corner chair and closed her eyes, breathing deeply as she mentally played through her piece, feeling each phrase, each transition. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Suddenly it was her turn and she was walking onto the stage, the polished grand piano waiting for her under the lights. The audience was a blur beyond the first few rows, where she could make out Jin, Vanessa, and her other friends giving encouraging smiles. Professor Harrington sat near the back, his posture as perfect as always. May adjusted the bench, placed her hands in her lap, and took one final breath. Then she positioned her hands over the keys and began to play. The opening of Liszt's Transcendental Etude No. 10 flowed from her fingers with a confidence that surprised her. The piece was a storm of emotions, dramatic and tender, technically demanding yet deeply expressive. As she played, the nervousness transformed into focus, then into something else entirely, a kind of transcendence where she was both completely present and somehow outside herself, watching her own performance unfold. When she struck the final chord, There was a moment of complete silence before the applause began. May Rose bowed slightly as she'd practiced and exited the stage on slightly wobbly legs. Backstage, she found Jin waiting with a bottle of water. "That was incredible," he said, handing her the water. "Seriously, May, you should have seen Professor Harrington's face. I've never seen him look so, I don't know, proud maybe?" The rest of the day passed in a blur. May listened to a few other competitors, then returned to her hotel room to rest. That evening, at the announcement of finalists, she heard her name called and felt a surge of disbelief mixed with elation. She had made it to the finals. The final round the next day was both more terrifying and somehow easier. The pressure was immense, but having survived the preliminaries gave May a foundation of confidence. She played with even more abandon, taking the interpretive risks that Professor Harrington had encouraged, finding emotional colors in the music that she hadn't fully expressed before. When the winners were announced that evening, May stood with the other 5 finalists on stage, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Third place went to a young man from Curtis Institute, second place to a girl from Eastman. Then the chief judge stepped forward to announce the first place winner. For a performance that combined exceptional technical facility with profound musical insight, the first prize in the youth division goes to Mei Chen from Wellington Music Academy. The next moments were a blur, walking forward to accept the crystal trophy, shaking hands with the judges, posing for photographs. Backstage, she was engulfed in a group hug from her friends, then received a rare handshake from Professor Harrington. "Well done, Ms. Chen," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. Later that night, in the quiet of her hotel room, May called her grandmother. "Nai, I won." Her grandmother's joyful exclamation made May smile through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I knew you would, May. Tell me everything." As May recounted the day's events, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From the little girl practicing on an out-of-tune piano in her grandmother's living room, to the shy transfer student hiding in the back of the classroom, to this moment, standing on a prestigious stage, being recognized for her talent. "Are you happy, May?" her grandmother asked when May finished her story. May thought about the question. Happy seemed too simple a word for what she felt. "I'm grateful," she said finally. "For you, for my teachers, for my friends, for music, and for yourself," her grandmother prompted gently. "Are you proud of yourself?" That question was harder to answer. May had spent so many years downplaying her abilities, hiding her light, that accepting praise, even from herself, still felt uncomfortable. But something had shifted during these months of intensive work, these moments of public performance. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I am proud." When she returned to Wellington 2 days later, something had changed. Not just in how others saw her, though the competition win had certainly raised her profile at the academy, but in how she saw herself. She no longer felt like an imposter, no longer felt the need to hide her talent or apologize for it. At her next lesson with Professor Harrington, he surprised her by asking, "What's next, Ms. Chen?" May had been expecting to discuss technical details of her performance, areas for improvement. "Next? You've proven yourself on a significant stage. This is just the beginning, so I ask again, what's next?" For the first time since she'd begun studying music, May allowed herself to look beyond the next practice session, the next piece to learn, the next hurdle to overcome. She thought about all the music still waiting to be explored, all the ways she could grow as an artist, all the audiences she might someday reach. "Everything," she answered with a smile. "Everything is next."